It was the summer of 1917 and the Russian government was extremely unpopular. They had just launched a disastrous offensive on the Galician front that was supposed to boost morale if it succeeded, but it failed, and so now the entire Russian army was deserting in droves. In the wake of this disaster, among other reasons, the Russian Prime Minister and 4 of his cabinet ministers resigned. So with the Russian government just absolutely imploding, the people of Russia wondered if there was anybody who could replace them. The provisional government wasn't the only government in Russia. There was also a Soviet, which was essentially the city council of Russia, but effectively it had just as much, if not more, power than the provisional government. What if, the people thought, that we could give all power to the Petrograd Soviet and the other city Soviets around Russia? That was even a Bolshevik slogan, all power to the Soviets, and the Bolsheviks were also gaining in popularity. They got 54% of the seats in the workers' section of the Petrograd Soviet, but they still didn't have a majority in the soldiers' section. So, some soldiers in Russia began planning armed demonstrations in favour of all power being given to the Soviets and taken away from the provisional government. Certain machine gunners went to other units to try to convince them to help them plan the armed uprising, and the Bolsheviks knew they had to stop this. You see, if these armed demonstrations did occur, then they could well escalate into a revolt. And the Bolsheviks knew that if this escalated into a revolt, then it would be bad news for them. You see, at least quite a lot of the people in these revolts would be calling not for the Soviet to take full power, but for the Bolsheviks to take full power. And why would this be a bad thing? Well, it's very simple. The Bolsheviks could have probably taken control of Petrograd if they wanted to. They were popular enough in the city that they could do that, but why didn't they? Because they were popular in Petrograd, but that's not the only place in Russia. The rest of Russia would turn against them, and the city would be besieged, and it would fall. The Bolsheviks didn't revolt yet because they weren't popular enough to do so. So the Bolsheviks sent people out to tell these troops not to join the armed demonstrations. A massive propaganda battle was waged throughout the day. Bolshevik representatives were sent out, giving speeches to the soldiers, telling them, do not join this armed protest that is being planned. But hotter heads prevailed, and by the 16th of July, armed demonstrations were occurring in the capital city of Russia in favour of all power to the Soviets. Soldiers and workers both took part in these protests. The Bolsheviks realised that they couldn't stop these protests, and so instead, they urged all those protesting soldiers and workers to go straight to the Tauride Palace where the provisional government was, and present their demands there. Other protesting workers and soldiers besieged the headquarters of the Petrograd Soviet and said, no, you are going to take power, and if you refuse to take power, we will make you take power, okay? They weren't asking the Soviet to become in charge of Russia. They weren't allowing the Soviet to become in charge of Russia. They were telling the Soviet, you're going to be in charge of Russia. But yet the Soviets still continually refused to take power. The government was helpless. All the soldiers in the city were either joining the protests and mutinying or refusing to defend the government. Their only hope was if loyalist units could return from the front and save them from certain doom. Supposedly, one of the protesting workers even yelled at a member of the Soviet saying, take power when it is offered to you, you son of a bitch! I didn't even know that word had a direct translation from English to Russian. There were many in the city who were calling for the active overthrowal of the provisional government, and this could happen at any time. They simply had to organise all these spontaneous protests and riots into an organised force where they could storm the Tauride Palace and arrest the provisional government. They could do it at any time if they could get organised and get together. A day after the uprising started, on the 17th of July, 20,000 revolutionary soldiers from the island of Kronstadt arrived in the city to support the rebellion. They went to Lenin's house and expected him to give a massive, rousing speech advocating the complete overthrow of the provisional government and putting the Bolsheviks in charge. Okay, these people weren't, all power to the Soviets. These people were in favour of all power to the Bolsheviks. Yet here's the thing, Lenin had a dilemma. Remember how earlier I said that if Lenin took power, all the people in Russia would team up and get rid of him? Exactly. Lenin knew that he couldn't use this to take advantage of this and overthrow the government, because that just wouldn't work. It was a doomed uprising where he would lose, but if he didn't overthrow the government and try to take control of Russia, he would also lose, because the Bolsheviks were going to get blamed for these protests. Many in the protests were Bolshevik supporters, and they were marching under Bolshevik slogans such as peace, land, bread, and all power to the Soviets. Therefore, if the provisional government survived, the Bolsheviks were going to get the blame for it. So there's going to be like a massive wave of anti-Bolshevik suppression. Lenin lost either way. Lenin, however, decided that his party could survive a wave of suppression. It could not, however, survive the entirety of Russia turning against them. So when he gave that speech to the 20,000 Kronstadt sailors, he was more restrained than they expected them to be, and it was disappointing. The crowd dispersed at the end. And remember how I said that they could have taken control of the government building? Had they tried? Well, that's the thing. They didn't try because this was completely disorganised. There was no way to organise all these groups into a coherent structure enough to storm the palace. There was no plan to storm the palace, and so they didn't. So eventually, loyalist units arrived from the front, and all the rebels either got bored and went home, or they got crushed by loyalist units. The revolution had failed. And now Lenin had another dilemma. You see, he had just been accused of being a German agent. You know, as that wave of anti-Bolshevik suppression after the rebellion that I just mentioned. So he had to decide. Was he going to escape to Finland and not be put on trial? But that would imply that he was guilty if he was escaping. Or would he allow himself to be put on trial in the hope that the jury would acquit him? Well, he decided to escape to Finland to not get exiled, not get arrested, because he knew that there was little to no chance of getting a fair trial. Remember that offensive I mentioned at the start of the video? Well, Kerensky, the guy that organised that offensive, was made Prime Minister after this, and so Kerensky, as Prime Minister, decided to restore the death penalty in the Russian army, at least on the front. But the death penalty only became legal in theory. It was still not going to be tolerated among the soldiers. He also denied Finland's declaration of independence, and he resigned all his positions, but everybody begged him to come back, and so he said, okay, I'll come back, under the condition that I'm allowed to choose whoever I want to be in my cabinet. He also arrested several Bolshevik leaders, you know, for being German agents. The Bolsheviks had to go semi-underground for a bit after this. So in the next part of this series on the Russian Revolution, I am going to make a video about how the Bolsheviks overthrow the Russian government. And if you would like to see that, I'm going to put it on the end screen when I make the video, okay?